One of the most important aspects of working in Illustrator is to understand the advantages and disadvantages of working with vectors. You probably heard that the main difference between Illustrator and Photoshop is that while Photoshop is working with photographs, which are pixel-based images, Illustrator mainly works with vector objects. So in this video, I will explain why is that and what that means. First thing that you will notice when you zoom closer to a design in Illustrator is that no matter how close you go to, it will always be crisp around the edges. So you won't see any loss in quality no matter how close you go. You can see I'm already 2000% close to my design. And in Creative Cloud version of Illustrator, you can go all the way up to 64,000%. So that's an incredibly high magnification. And you will still not see any pixels appearing in your design, as long as you keep working with vectors. Of course, there is an overlap because Illustrator can also apply pixel or raster effects and even use images, which are pixel-based. But primarily, I would say 95% of what Illustrator does is vector-based. On the contrary, if we switch to Photoshop and we have the same image opened up here, it's actually the one that I saved or exported earlier into a JPEG format. We will see what happens once we start zooming onto this. So you see, we are in Photoshop right now. It looks quite similar to Illustrator, but at the bottom, we have already 100% magnification selected, which is called actual pixel size in Photoshop. Any further magnification than this will start revealing pixelation. So if I zoom in using Command+, you already start to see some kind of loss in quality. But the further I zoom in, the more you will see the problem. And after a while, you actually start to see the pixel grid. So in case of a low resolution image, you will see a lot of pixels appearing in all of the details. And in case of pixel images, you will always be limited by the amount of pixels you have. The way you can find out about the amount of pixels is by right-clicking and holding down your mouse on the status bar, which will reveal exactly the amount of pixels you have in the document. So it's 458 by 435 in this case, which would be considered as a low resolution image. Now you might ask, why is this so low resolution? Because we designed this in Illustrator. Well, the reason why it's low resolution is because when I exported it, I didn't specify that I need a high resolution version from it. So let me just switch back to Illustrator for a second, and let's export this artboard once again, but with high resolution. If I go up to File, Export, Export As, and choose that I want to save again to artboards, but I'm going to call it high res. And in this case, I will just save the first artboard. I don't need the other ones. So if I click on Export, I can now decide what resolution I want. And you see the default is called screen resolution, and it's 72 ppi, which is pixel per inch. Now that is used mainly for web design, but it's not big enough or high resolution enough for a print. For that, normally we use 300 ppi, which is another standard. But if you want to go any higher than that, because you are working with vectors that are resolution independent, you can pick whatever size you wish. So if I choose other, I could even type in 2000 ppi if I want to, or go even beyond that. But for now, let's just stick to the default 300 ppi and save it with all the rest of the settings as default. So if I click OK, I can open up that file and we will see the difference. So first of all, the difference here that I can see is the original was 603 kilobytes. That's the file size. And this new one is slightly bigger, 753, but it will be much higher resolution. So if I open this one up in Photoshop, you can see that by default, it is actually 33% the magnification. And if I use Command 1 or Control 1, I can zoom to the actual pixel size, the 100%, And that already shows how much more detail we have in this image. But just to double check, I can right click on the status bar, and yes, I can see it's slightly more than 4 times bigger. So once again, to compare the two, you can see if I zoom slightly close to the same detail level, we can compare the two of them and see how much better the high resolution image looks. But don't forget, no matter how big you save a raster image format like a JPEG or PNG file, you will always have pixelation after a while. So if I zoom close, even here we will start to see loss and degradation in the quality. So let's see what happens if we look at the photograph. Here I have a nice big panorama, and this is actually an image that I stitched together using the photo merge feature in Photoshop. The reason I'm showing this example because this is a very high resolution image. If we look at the bottom on the status bar, we can show it's above 10,000 pixels for the width of this document. So this would be considered definitely a very high resolution image. And that means if I keep zooming into a detail like this little hut here on the left, you will see that even zooming in this close, we still haven't reached the actual pixel size. So if I keep zooming even closer, there's still more details. And now I reached beyond 100%. So I'm now above the actual pixel size. So if I would continue zooming any closer than that, after a while, we will start to see the pixels. But when I zoom further backward, I can press Command 1 to quickly jump back to the actual pixel size. Now I can see that this is definitely a very high resolution image. So although Photoshop and raster images are limited to the amount of pixels they have, they can still hold a lot of details depending on the original amount of pixels. Now, of course, having a lot of pixels in a file means also the file size itself will be very big. And that is another advantage of an Illustrator file, is that when you work with vectors, you are not increasing the file size as much. So even with more complex designs like this, the file size will be only a few megabytes, while that photograph I showed you, the panorama, can already be around 10-20 megabytes, depending on the compression you use. Now there's one other interesting option in Illustrator called Pixel Preview from the View menu, which can actually show you, with the current size of your artboard, how much detail you would get once you export into a raster or pixel format. So if I choose Pixel Preview and I zoom closer into this design, I can see how much detail it will have. So it's almost like looking at the already exported pixel or raster format of this current design. It's almost like working in Photoshop, so anything beyond 100% will start to pixelate. And you can switch back, of course, at any time to the normal view, where you have the crisp and nice sharp vector outlines. So to summarize the difference between working with pixels and vectors, the main advantage of vector design is that there is no restriction on print size, so all the graphics are resolution independent, and your file size will always be quite small compared to a raster image. The only real disadvantage of vector images is that it's hard to make things look photorealistic. That's why it's mainly used for illustrations. Now, the advantage of working with pixel or raster images is that the pixels, all those little details, allow subtle and complex variety of details that is needed, for example, in photography. But of course, the downside of working with pixels is that the detail and print size is restricted by the resolution or original amount of pixels. And also that the file size is usually much bigger than a vector files. In this course, we are going to work with vector objects mainly, but we will also use images. So along the way, it will make even more sense the difference between the two different technologies. The good news is that Illustrator is probably the best tool when it comes to working with vectors.